Hey, here we are for part 2 of the chapter 8 talk through. Okay, so in 161, moving quickly into 162. We're talking about how racial segregation then relates to racial inequality, more generally, the title in red there. Now, how does this work? How does residential segregation affect these things? First of all, there's the obvious influence of money, right? So that race and income and wealth, as we've seen, and you can see on the charts on 161, are pretty highly correlated. That is, that there on average are differences between racial groups and how much money they have. And so that as racial groups or individuals actually have more money, they tend to get better quality housing, which tends to just be the general relationship. But as it says on we turn to 162, this is not so much the case on average with African Americans, so that even as their income goes up, they don't go into quality housing. And the wacky thing is here, it's more complicated than what Scott really gets into here, is that high quality housing is also correlated with race, right? So that in effect they're saying, oh, okay, so as people get more money, they tend to be less residentially segregated, with the exception of blacks on average. I mean, there are certainly some blacks in the affluent suburbs and things like that, but for the most part, it's not as much as other groups once they get some income and stuff, right? The second thing that she addresses there is how does this work is just sort of in-group preference, right? To this sort of point that, oh, well, there's to some degree that people just like people who are like themselves, and they're more comfortable, and they just get along easier since they sort of share the same culture and things like that and values, right? Now, without getting into what exactly the cultural differences are, whatever, that's certainly partially true, and across a variety of social domains, from churches to schools to who you sit with at the school lunch counter or whatever, the work lunch counter. But there are also some differences that point out that they talk about these neighborhood integration scenarios, so that there are differences with racial groups' comfort with each other, so that when the percentage of African Americans in particular or other minorities increases, whites and Asians in particular, and whites in particular, I should say, get less comfortable, both experimentally, which is what she's talking about, just in sort of computer modelings with experiments, and also in real life, and of course. All right, and of course this is somewhat related to the issue of white flight, right? The important issue of white flight that's related to the neighborhood changing over in Los Angeles that we talked about. Once a certain neighborhood starts to have some minorities in it, historically and continuing to some degree today, whites have taken off. They've moved, okay? This is huge. It's happened in Chicago. It's happened all over the place. I mean, there's lots of studies of it in Chicago. So that actually the penetration in terms of like actual numbers or percentages of African Americans that move in, it can be quite small. But then the whites just start taking off. The property value, and other whites don't move in to replace them. And then relatively quickly, towns can simultaneously, because of the correlation of race and wealth, become sort of minority communities and also lose a lot of their property value and stuff, right? So that's the issue of white flight. And we have a little video on that in this week. It's a little short one. And what you see is people moving out to the suburbs from the cities is what this particular aspect of white flight is, and then removing back into the city and gentrifying the inner city, which means that it becomes, instead of the working class or the poor folks, it becomes the gentry, the wealthy people coming back, redoing a lot of the old buildings, perhaps especially in the Midwest, doing up some of the old factory spaces and old brick buildings and making them lofts or something like that. And that's the gentrification process, which we're not really mostly interested in. And the problem is, minority folks tend to get squeezed out again, or squeezed out rather, not again. All right. Well, go to 164, 165. Some of the consequences of residential segregation has to do. The really big one, which you only get 2 paragraphs here, is education. I mean, just think about, you guys are more familiar probably with Fort Wayne, or if you come from another city. I know a lot of you guys come from small towns. It's not going to work here if you don't have multiple high schools and multiple ethnicities or races present. But you think about it like, oh, certain neighborhoods tend to be, literally different shades of skin, often, of course, correlated with income. And then those neighborhoods tend to map onto different schools, not always, but and then those schools, you could probably say, oh, what are the good schools, what are the bad schools? And I wouldn't be surprised at all if most of the folks who thought about that said, like, oh, wow, like the good schools tend to be a little paler in complexion and the bad ones tend to be darker. And that's one huge way in which residential segregation sort of reproduces racial inequality, so that more numbers of minorities can go to worse schools, have less chances of doing well in college, etc., get poor educations, while white folks tend to be going to the better schools, this is generalities here, but are truthful generalities, hopefully, and then have a better shot at education. Safety is another huge thing. We've got a music video from a song when I was in college called 911 is a Joke, so that crime tends to be differentially dispersed based on racial composition as well as class composition. And that's a compound problem. I mean, there are many aspects of that, and one of them, the most obvious, is that people who are poor tend to do more crime. You could also talk about, which that video talks about, is that this social services, including police and EMTs and stuff like that, don't serve communities of color as well as they do. And there's been a good deal of statistical backup to the point of that song or whatever, and hopefully that song's just sort of an entertaining point that this has been going on for a while. There's physical health differences that make huge differences. Average ages and general healthiness matter quite a bit. Obesity rates change depending on where folks live. And then just feeling out of place, that so that when people are segregated, when they go to a unsegregated area of town or an unsegregated context, they say they do get bused to a different school, as it happens in some places, that the general comfort level is there because people just aren't practiced with that. Okay. Myth of the ghetto welfare queen is really interesting because I don't know how pervasive this is now, but in the late 80s and stuff, and actually mid 80s too, this was a real big common stereotype about welfare, that people were getting rich off of it. Of course, there are a couple of exceptions of welfare fraud where this happened, but for the most part, I mean, it is possible to think about roles and ways in which people could have problems with entitlement and stuff like that. And in general, most people are not getting rich on welfare, right? Actual welfare itself is about $200 a month. So if you're getting just your welfare, you're not exactly living high on the hog. Is the general evidence suggests that people are not doing that. But for political reasons, the myth of the welfare queen has been useful in arguments about how much should we subsidize poor people and how much should we sort of encourage their independence from the system. Of course, that all depends on arguments about how much can they get independent from the system and how much can they support themselves in the regular job market and stuff like that. Complicated stuff, but definitely you should know about this. It's a controlling image, actually, going back to Patricia Hill Collins, right? Anyway, bottom of the page, status, power, and gatekeeping. There's gatekeeping is an important thing to wrap your brain around. That throughout your life in various institutions, there are people in positions of power in institutions who will let you in or not let you in, right? And so that they differentiate. It's not terrifically important differentiation between status-based power and position-based power, and that these people, sometimes just acting according to the rules of the institution, sometimes being individually prejudiced, and sometimes both, can be have important roles to play in sort of maintaining residential segregation, particularly, or sort of racial discrimination more generally. Okay, they mentioned some roles that recommendations for dismantling racial segregation there at the end, and you should definitely take a look at that. And finally, oh yeah, this is interesting on 168 and 169. Sort of a brief history of the urban black ghetto, which is a result of industrialization and sort of great migrations to the north in the middle parts of the 20th century, as well as getting black folks getting used to having previously lived in the South in rural areas, and then because they're coming up north for good factory jobs and stuff like that, they're tending to live in cities, and then cities being, well, frankly, scared of that, white cities to a certain degree, and so sort of creating up areas that they encourage black folks to live and discourage them from other places. So anyway, a good history of that. These things did not just naturally occur; they sort of happened. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a pretty good coverage of the points. Definitely watch the videos, get the basics, take notes on them. I think they're pretty well done and hopefully pretty self-explanatory. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll go from there. Thanks.